Mm.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society and the Institute for Rebooting Social Media's Fall Speaker Series. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our guests for today's conversation, the impact of conspiracy theories at home and online. Jessalyn Cook is an award-winning investigative reporter and nonfiction author who has written extensively about online conspiracy theories and their offline harms. Her new book for Penguin Random House, The Quiet Damage, QAnon, and the Destruction of the American Family, won a Lucas Prize. Prior to covering the tech beat at NBC News, she was a senior reporter on HuffPost's National Enterprise Desk. Ben Reininga, yes, is the former head of editorial at Snapchat, where he established partnerships with major news organizations, built protocols to fight misinformation, and worked to create a more engaging and diverse content experience. Prior to that, he spent more than a decade in editing, video production, and newsroom management. Moderating today's chat, we have Jonathan Zittrain, the George Bemis Professor of International Law at Harvard Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, Professor of Computer Science at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and co-founder of the Berkman Klein Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody, both in the room and out there in webinar land for tuning in. And I'm so grateful for the long-term relationship. I'm just going to move that farther away. The long-term relationship that the Berkman Klein Center has had with the Nieman Foundation. And the presence in our midst of Nieman Fellows drawn from the far reaches of journalism here at Berkman Klein has just been wonderfully, and I'll use a word that is now overused, generative, and we're really grateful for it. And thank you, Ben and Jessalyn, specifically for coming out today, and congratulations, Jessalyn, on a book that is compelling and a difficult read. There's a lot of stories and a lot that you reported on here. And before we dive into just a little bit of the various narratives, I'm curious, just as an analytic table setting, how you would define conspiracy thinking or conspiracy theory, and how much that definition depends on some ground truth up front, or is there a way to identify it irrespective of the truth value of the beliefs?
So many conspiracy. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. And a lot of conspiracy theories really have that base level of truth. So many of them incorporate a grain of truth that really just works as building blocks where people kind of weave in wilder and wilder elements that eventually really start to resonate with people. And so when I think about conspiracy theories, it really just, it can sometimes begin as just healthy skepticism that gets distorted and exaggerated and kind of turns into this reflexive suspicion that I think we've started to see across the political spectrum, especially in recent months, where people are so prone to just automatically be suspicious and be doubtful and jump to conclusions without waiting for evidence to come into place. And so conspiracy theories just have, in this book especially, have really, for so many people, not just been about the facts or the truth or the questions, but on a deeper level, how it makes them feel and the service that it does for them in serving some underlying human need.
And I guess there's some respect in which you're figuring that how it makes them feel is against a backdrop of how they were feeling to begin with, what their baseline was, that it's less about exposure to certain words in a line or sounds that they hear in a video, that they're already in a disposition that might be ripe. Is that a fair assessment?
It is, and I think there's a belief that conspiracy theorists, especially at the QAnon level, are necessarily unintelligent or stupid. And what I try to illustrate in the book and what I argue is that if two different people were to encounter the same conspiracy theory online, it's not necessarily the person who is less educated who would come to believe it. It's more likely someone who is feeling unfulfilled in some aspect of their life, whether they're seeking a sense of belonging or a sense of purpose. Conspiracy theories, conspiracy theory movements especially, can be really participatory and can really help people find a way to feel like they matter, to feel like they're important. And that, to a lot of people, is more precious than the truth ever could be.
And you did thousands of hours of interviews, is that fair to say?
Oh gosh, yeah, no, it was a lot. So for the book, I profile 5 American families from across the country, but I just as part of my research, traveled around, attended a bunch of QAnon rallies, and interviewed hundreds of families where at least one member had gone down the ideological rabbit hole. And so I put in the time to do a lot of reporting before I ever sat down to write, just to make sure I was, for one thing, just trying to illustrate that it's not one kind of demographic box of person who gets into these ideas. I think there's a stereotype that maybe it's just conservatives or white people or boomers, and that's absolutely not true. So I talk to people from all different walks of life, different political views, even former Bernie Sanders supporters, different races, different generations, to kind of paint a full picture of what we're dealing with here.
And were you able to speak to them just person to person? Hey, I'm asking some questions, really curious what you think, given how central the media often is to the narratives of the day and how it's usually not a good player. How did they view you, and what assurances did they seek or want, implicit, explicit, and just to talk to you?
That was, I assumed it would be a lot harder than it actually was. The reporting, so many of the QAnon believers who I would talk to, after a while, it would almost become a relationship where they wanted to talk to me more than I had availability to speak to them. And I think what it illustrated to me was so many of these people who have really, really gone to the extreme lengths of these conspiracy theories have isolated themselves from their loved ones, from their friends, from their families, and they just didn't actually have many people to talk to. And I was someone who was there to listen, and to listen without judgment. And sometimes they would try to tell me, like, okay, you're part of the media, but you're just too dumb to understand that you're a cog in this machine. The media is part of the deep state. Your editors, your bosses, the news corporations are part of the deep state. You're just dumb, and you don't understand that you're serving this evil. And if they had.
And how would you react to that?
I mean, I really, in none of these interviews was I trying to persuade or dissuade or change anyone's actual views. It's not a book about debunking. It's a book about understanding and trying to understand how, in many cases, sane, decent, normal people can come to believe these extreme and wild things. So when I would get stuff like that, I would just, respect what they think and respectfully disagree.
Now, one of the basic tenets for a journalist is to do their own research. And across all of those hours at rallies, I assume that even included PowerPoint presentations of various kinds, lectures, conversations. Was there any moment in which you were like, huh,
Did I get red pilled?
that footprint on the moon is pretty shallow?
Oh, gosh. Well, no, I didn't ever slip toward QAnon territory, but I will say, I think what doing all this research and these interviews did for me was give me more empathy to understand where they were coming from, because a lot of these delusions are rooted in very real fears. A lot of people who did not want to get vaccinated, despite the harms to public health, they genuinely believed that vaccines could kill them or could make them infertile or could do all these things. And so really trying to understand where these progressively wild ideas were coming from helped me kind of, I think, view them with less judgment. And just, there's so many of these divisions where I think we almost automatically laugh at and ridicule conspiracy theorists without trying to understand the stepping stones that got them to the extreme lengths they've reached.
Mm-hmm. And I'd love to maybe hear about a narrative or two of the sorts of families that you center in the book. And maybe one way into that is just to say, would they agree with one another about what QAnon is? What sorts of beliefs or behaviors mean you're in the club versus out of the club?
I think at the core of QAnon, which is kind of just blended into some of our politics now, is this sentiment of pitchfork populism, this idea of us versus them, the elites versus the people. And that sentiment was definitely true across all the stories in the book. And
so far, that's like the Tea Party.
Yeah. There's this, I think to be a conspiracy theorist, you have to have a sense of powerlessness and a sense of victimhood. And that can be legitimate. One of the people I profile in the book is a mother of color who went through extreme hardship and poverty and racism growing up. And she had a lot of reasons to be suspicious of the system and the powers that be, and to have this lack of trust. I mean, historically, generations, there are so many reasons why marginalized communities have reasons to feel this lack of trust. But there are also stories in the book where...
And she had a sibling in BLM.
Yeah. It was these two sisters. One went into Black Lives Matter activism, the other went into QAnon, and it was really interesting reporting to try to understand how that fork happened. But I think for the sister who went the QAnon route, these anti-establishment conspiracy theories really vindicated for her this sense of distrust and this feeling that she had been wronged and it was true. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, there's one woman in the book who's a very privileged, wealthy, white lawyer, very educated, grew up with a ton of privilege, and she still came to feel that same level of victimhood as the mother of color I mentioned, but for her, it was something that she was conditioned to feel. You know, it kind of started out on Fox News and then kind of getting into these really extreme right-wing spaces where she was just fed this like drip of victim mentality rhetoric where she was constantly reminded that all these powers were out to get her, and she came to feel this powerlessness that was maybe less legitimate than other people's whose stories I tell.
Mhm. And among the stories, there are some folks who decided to take the exit ramp. Were there commonalities for that?
So many of the families I talk to who have asked me, how do I get my loved one back from the depths of QAnon? What they have mostly all started trying was fact checking. You know, my loved one is spewing falsehoods. I want to bring them facts. And to me, what I learned through doing this project is that that is really it's tackling the symptom, not the cause. For so many people who go down the rabbit hole, they're not actually interested in finding the truth. They don't actually want to be informed. They're just trying to serve some underlying need, whether it is a sense of belonging or it is a sense of purpose. And so the success stories in the book and the advice that I have started to give, I mean, there are a few pieces, but one is, you know, try to put aside the what of belief. Don't get so caught up in these wild, ludicrous ideas and try to understand the why. Try to understand what it really is that's appealing to them on a base level, and start there. You're going to have a lot more progress if instead of trying to cram facts down their throat, you try to understand, how can I help you meet this need in an offline, productive, healthy way?
And what does that mean then about the role of journalism and journalists? Is it basically a mismatch? Journalism is offering stories that are themselves, ideally, fact-checked, rigorous sourcing. I mean, there is a profession that is meant to approximate truth iteratively. And is it just, well, maybe this group isn't particularly the audience, or maybe it's they won't be looking at everything through that scrim. So if I'm writing about the city council meeting and the zoning plan, they can read that. But if it's about, I don't know, what's a core tenet of QAnon, like a substantive?
Child welfare, child safety, like, is that what you mean?
Yeah, maybe. And if it's like, oh, well, actually, you know, there isn't a basement in Comet Pizza, that's just a moment where there's nothing you could say that would change it. It's just not, the journalist just needs to report what they report and move on.
You know, the way I think about this is, for people who have kind of reached this extreme level, I do believe that facts can't fix this. And maybe that sounds a little crazy, but I think for the people who have come out of this, they really depended on their networks, their loved ones, to show them sustained compassion and patience. And journalists, it is our job to bring facts into the world and to do it in a way that feels accessible. And I do think there's a role for storytelling in this. And I do think local journalism, especially like getting out and doing good reporting, even with Trump's claim about like they're eating the dogs, like the best journalism, the best counter narrative we saw to that was local reporters going out and talking to residents of these communities and trying to elevate what they knew to be true. And so, I mean, the frustration I heard from the QAnon believers in my book with regard to the media was that there seemed to be this sense of elitism and almost condescension. And I think part of it, as journalists, we talk about this a lot of Nieman Fellows, is so much of the media is kind of concentrated on the East Coast and the West Coast. And I think so much good could come from trying to staff big newsrooms all over the country and try to represent people who don't usually see their stories in the press.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had mentioned reaching people offline, and this is a way ultimately to pivot to some thinking from Ben, but to what extent would you attribute to the online world and social media in bulk how it is, and I guess even the boundaries of social media are ever changing. I don't know if Telegram is social media or not. How much is the presence of social media versus the landscape in 1995 responsible for what we see? And I don't know, Jessalyn, if you want to give your sense first and then over to Ben to get his thoughts.
Sure. I mean, so conspiracy theories and mass delusions have been part of American history going back very, very far. This isn't a new phenomenon, but what social media has done is made it really hard for us to have a shared reality because all of us are traversing different versions of it online. We get pulled into these different echo chambers. We get a lot of reinforcement for ideas that we believe to be true that are very different from what, like there's a couple in my book, this older couple, they're both spending a lot of time on Facebook and they come away with entirely different impressions of what's going on in the world around them. And so I think that's where this digital technology has kind of accelerated our descent into suspicion and distrust.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the issue of kind of online solutions for offline causes is a really interesting one. I think when we start thinking about how to combat this from a platform standpoint, I think one of the things Jess's book does a really great job of laying out is how much there are sort of well-founded underlying causes for a lot of these beliefs. It wasn't that you encountered something on Facebook or on Twitter, X, in a vacuum and it threw you down the rabbit hole. It was a pre-existing sense of isolation or loneliness. I mean, even thinking about the Springfield, Ohio example, I think obviously the eating the dogs and eating the cats was a crazy bit of misinformation, but I think the best journalism and the best response to that is to look at kind of understanding what was going on in that community that made the people susceptible sort of emotionally to that type of untruth. Like what were the underlying, whether it's economic anxieties or anxieties about a changing, face of a community or something. Clearly there was a susceptibility there. And that makes it incredibly difficult. I think there obviously are interventions that can be done, the platforms, and we can talk more about those in a minute. I think I'm not here to be an apologist for the platforms. I think there's definitely more that they could do, but also a lot of complexities. I think also even just the notions of having a shared basis of truth is really interesting. Was reading about how Facebook has changed its guidance on whether saying the coronavirus was man-made is a conspiracy theory. That's been reversed like twice in the last couple of years because new information emerges and then is contradicted and is emerged and contradicted. And that's a reasonably simple one. Yeah, complicated, but I think accelerant is probably the right primary stance to have on that.
Well, it's been a minute. Let's talk about the platforms. And sorry, in particular, it'd be great to say a little bit more about the engine room you were in at Snap, and maybe touch on both your sense, something Jess talks about in the book a little bit, of the economic side of things from the platform point of view, ways in which certain behaviors are elicited by, humans testing the algorithm to see what gets 1 million likes versus 1,000 likes versus tumbleweeds. So that kind of nano-economics. And then it'd be great to hear from that engine room what responsibility is communicated to the folks there, if any, about conversations just among citizens, and what levers, if any, you found yourself moved to pull, what you had available to pull to affect the shape of that conversation.
Yeah, fascinating bunch of stuff in there. Snapchat's an interesting platform vis-a-vis these conversations about conspiracy theories in particular, because it is, and this sounds like corporate Kool-Aid, but they say privacy by default. And all I mean by that is that the core behavior is a private peer-to-peer sharing behavior, whereas on Instagram, the core behavior is a one-to-many broadcast behavior.
And I guess it was Snap that pioneered ephemerality.
Yes.
Which is weird that it had to be pioneered, but here we are.
Well, it also pioneered stories that was then stolen by Instagram and a bunch of other folks.
Patience is the sincerest form of flattery.
Yes, if you can't buy them, copy them, I think is how it goes. But because of that, in a way, Snapchat is a reasonably difficult place to spread a conspiracy theory because the public-facing content is pretty limited, and that is intensely moderated by humans.
And can I just ask, how do you know? If it's all kind of private and ephemeral, How do you know what the chicks are doing in the henhouse?
Yeah, so that's actually that's a great point. I mean, at a broad level, you don't, right? Peer-to-peer, private, encrypted, expiring messages are hard to monitor. I guess the way that a conspiracy theory typically spreads is through an element of virality that's a little harder on Snapchat because you're capped at a group message to something like 12 people. So it's easier to do that in maybe a Facebook group or a Telegram group where you can reach hundreds more. And that's not to say Snapchat's perfect. There was a big story in Rolling Stone over the summer about a group of parents who are suing the platform because their teens bought fentanyl-laced drugs, which is just an interesting, like in the way that maybe a certain virality of spreading misinformation is difficult in that platform design, then a more kind of secretive, illegal, like drug dealing behavior is actually easier to get away with. So that's an educated guess more than a certainty.
And do the Snap terms of service say, by the way, when you Snapchat with people, when you
Yeah.
chat Snap with people, don't do conspiracy theories. Is that in the TOS?
They will say no misinformation or deceptive misinformation, meaning deliberate misinformation or non-deliberate misinformation.
Tom Brady didn't inflate his
Yeah.
footballs.
Well, so that's the issue, right? Like it's not against the terms of service to lie. And I think the terms of service at Snapchat and everywhere else are written with a deliberate vagueness so that they sound good, but that it's incredibly difficult to actually
Audience are they
pinpoint.
written for?
I mean, what's a corporate way of saying cover your ass? I mean, I think you want to have I think all of the platforms, broadly speaking, have an external and an internal set of guidelines, which is to say there's something that they publish on their website that's pretty brief.
This is starting to sound like a conspiracy. I didn't say a conspiracy theory. I just said a conspiracy. Yeah.
Well, they would just say that, you don't need to put all the details out in the world. There's lots that companies keep internal.
But what they're nervous about, for which an aggressive sounding terms of service around disinformation might be the corporate remedy, is that there will be people in authority, public or private, that say you're not doing enough to deal with disinformation. Is that the audience they're worried about?
Yes, or people pointing at, a parent group that sees racy photos of ladies in bikinis and says this violates your terms of service because I can point to X portion, you're violating your own terms of service. But not to go too far down the plot there. I mean, I think the moderation.
Well,
terms
I
that
should just tell you,
yeah.
the question behind my question was kind of, I wonder if these days the constituencies that a company like Snap might be equally or more worried about would be ones that talk about corporate censorship. And
Yeah.
oh gosh, you're holding back the lab leak theory, which look at that, now the CDC is saying it's all true, and you were the ones tamping it down. Like, isn't that another external?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And there's probably increasing pressures from both sides. I think we've seen the sort of right-wing anti-tech pressure has really ramped up, or it did in even the last 3 to 4 years that I was at Snapchat, where they would take a certain level of concern much more seriously. I mean, I would say broadly also that the moderation teams I worked on were full of good, smart people who were trying to do their best, and that it is extremely difficult.
But the classic form of moderation, question mark, is somebody makes a complaint about something they saw, and then you got to figure out whether to have its ephemerality accelerated.
Yes, or we do proactive and reactive moderation. So there's an element of looking at things before they get published or as close to the time of publication as you can. And for closed peer-to-peer messaging, that's really like an AI that's looking for the very worst of the worst, child sexual exploitation, or in certain instances, acts of severe criminality. So they're really not looking at lies or misinformation. And then on the public front, there's a broader set of public-facing community guidelines that do cut into mis and disinformation. But then also on all the platforms, there's a second reactive user complaint trigger that will either reduce virality or distribution until it gets reviewed by a human, or sort of take it down preemptively. The platforms approach that differently. Though I'd note that that one's also extremely complicated because people weaponize that. I mean, I would.
They could brigade reports around
Yeah.
somebody saying something they don't like.
Well, and you also I mean, I worked on the team for a minute, or someone on my team was part of the people who had to review that. And primarily, you get expressions of homosexuality, a shocking number of depictions of interracial marriage, and a lot of sports content, because if you say the Giants are going to lose on Sunday, people mark that as hate speech because they're diehard Giants fans, which is just to say that like the populace are not necessarily also.
And they just get
perfect
back a
stewards.
note that says, "Thank you, we've reviewed your report very
Yes.
carefully, and we're actually Giants fans."
Yes, but maybe within 72 hours when, the harm, as it were, has already been done or that speech has already been repressed.
The game is over.
Which is just to say, yeah, and you see people's prejudices. I mean, if you let the Snapchat community or any community decide what was or wasn't acceptable, you'd probably have some legit misinformation get pulled down, but you'd also have some really hateful, you'd never see two men holding hands on a image because there'd be enough people who would pull that down. Educated guess, but you run into a lot of that stuff too. So you can't just let the people decide, I guess.
Vox Pop, we should open it up a little bit. I don't know, we've laid down some track with each of Jess and Ben. Are there questions, thoughts?
From the back over here.
Thank you so much for an excellent discussion. I'm curious, to the extent that confronting conspiracy theories requires this level of nuance, this understanding of where people are coming from, how do you view, what changes do you think are necessary to corporate culture, whether that's at newsrooms or tech platforms, et cetera, to sort of approach these without the airs of censorship or elitism or whatever? Is it having someone who's the dedicated QAnon correspondent or someone who's bringing those viewpoints into the room? Because I think a lot of people who work in those spaces view their mission as being bringing truth to this conversation, not necessarily bringing the same level of understanding or compassion.
I mean, I think this is the big question. It's really hard to understand where to draw those lines. What is acceptable? What is truth? What is fact? Because some of it is black and white, but so much of it is gray. And I guess the most thinking I've done in this space, I'm a tech reporter, and so I think a lot about how platforms should try to address these issues. And to be honest, I'm less concerned about what kind of content platforms will allow to host on their sites. Whether even like truths and falsehoods, to me, it's not so much about what we're allowed to say or what we're not. It's more how this content is treated. And so what is eligible for monetization? What is eligible for algorithmic amplification? And that's where I really think we need to be very mindful about where we draw these lines, how we draw these lines. And it's still not an easy question to answer, as I'm sure Ben can get into more. But I think so much of the kind of public outrage about censorship and the kind of partisanship here is driven by really valid concern. Free expression is very key to us here in America. And even with Ben's example of kind of the walk back Facebook had to do or Meta had to do with some of its COVID misinformation is a good example of why we don't necessarily want some billionaires in Silicon Valley making these decisions for us or running them through their companies. But I especially beyond just misinformation when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to these really thorny issues, these are the areas where I wouldn't mind seeing a little bit more overly aggressive rules in place for dialing down that amplification and just seeing how this content performs on its own without this unnatural boost, because these platforms love to just say we're just hosting, we're just, we're third party.
Before Ben jumps in, hold that thought, Ben. Jess, I wanted to see if you wanted to take a whack at the nanoeconomics question, because you're talking about sort of natural virality and unnatural virality. Is there an economic dimension to that or something else? What would cause a platform to want to push something forward?
Well, these are the kinds of pieces of content that really go viral. And so the more eyeballs they can get on content, the more money they can earn through ad revenue. And this isn't just about the platforms making money. I've done a lot of interviewing in my work as a reporter to content creators who are directly incentivized by these rules to go out and generate and spread misinformation, because they can make money that way, either directly through a cut of the ad revenue. A lot of platforms will pay creators to go viral, or just, I did a lot of reporting on these like high school aged boys on Instagram who would post wildly false things on Instagram because they learned through experimentation that those were the things that would blow up the most, and then they could sell merchandise and other things on their platforms. And so
What's an example of something?
oh gosh, there's a bunch of really kind of crude, wild falsehoods about AOC. There was stuff saying that Bill Gates was a Satan worshiper. That, it goes all over the place. But I talked to them, I interviewed them, and I said, do you believe any of this stuff? Are you posting it because you think it's true? And they said, no, this is because what'll go viral on Instagram. And this
And
is
when
what'll
it goes viral and people share it, do you think they're sharing it because they think it's true?
That's a really good question. I think a lot of it is emotion driven. It just feels, if you hate AOC and you see something really mean said about her and false, it feels good to like it and share it. But at the end of the day, this is just this cycle where these platforms are incentivizing their creators to spread more of this content and then rewarding it with virality. And you see people like some of the folks in my book who are just searching for truth online get really swept up into all of this.
Don't shoot the messenger, right? As they say.
Yeah. Oh man, lots to say about that. I mean, there was an interesting stat I saw recently that 80% or so of people could detect if a headline was false, but about 50% would share it anyway. Because either clout or, I mean, I was fascinated in the spate of hurricane misinformation. There was an RNC official, Amy Kramer was her name, who shared one of those ludicrous photos of a AI little girl clutching a puppy and got called out for it being AI and just responded and said, basically, I don't care if this is literally false, it's emotionally true. Like, this reflects to me what I understand FEMA to be doing, even if this isn't a literal representation. And I think that is like a really insidious and difficult thing to
For
fight.
which then it might be that she'd technically be okay labeling it as an AI image and it would
Yeah.
still have that visceral impact.
Well, totally. And to get back a little bit to the original question, I mean, I think it was the Carnegie Endowment listed out a bunch of platform interventions that folks had tried based on how effective they were, but sort of how easy they were to scale. And fact checking and labeling, unfortunately, falls on the very easy to do and pretty much useless in terms of its effect. Actually, often, if you have a deeply held conspiracy theory like belief, the existence of the fact check will sort of just re-entrench you, or it'll prove your point that the tech giants are trying to suppress the truth or whatever. So that tends to be a less effective mechanism. In that same study, one of the things they did find was much more effective would be what Jess is talking about, which is sort of working on changing platform incentives. Because the platforms do, you could imagine a world where it's pretty open what you could post, but where the platforms exercise something closer to editorial control over monetization and distribution. And if you could better police what gets, for you eligibility and the ability to make money off of ads, you might be able to reduce some of those incentives. We would see, I have a million stories of this, we'd see over and over and over again that if you give people an incentive to post a certain sort of content, it is almost impossible to create a moderation infrastructure that will stop them from that content. Like, if you can make money off of doing it, you can basically have a million other penalties, suspend your account.
There's the power of incentives and the power of
1000%,
economics.
yeah.
That is the market.
1000%. Snapchat thought they were so clever introducing a tool that would let you optimize the cover image for a piece of content. You could put 4 images and it would run a ABCD test for the first hour, show them to 25% each of the audience. Seemed very clever, boosted engagement in all these tests. And just instantly people learned that it was a way of throwing 4 pieces of spaghetti at the wall and seeing which one was just inside the acceptable limit of the content guidelines, like the raciest or the most outlandish photo you could get away with. And we'd sort of inadvertently invented a tool that allowed people to A/B test our own guidelines. So yeah, those incentives are very strong.
And it calls to mind the phrase that markets eat law or norms for breakfast. Yeah. Other questions? Somebody in the front? Maybe somebody in the back, wherever the mic goes.
I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts about Twitter/X and their recent, at least sort of from my point of view, of more acceptance of conspiracy theory content and like community note style version of fact checking, and how that might be a different route than some of the other social media platforms are taking, and how that might affect the conspiracy theory market.
Yeah, curious, are people familiar with community notes? Any community noters among us? I don't know which of you wants to take that, but maybe a word or two about community notes. And it is a test of Ben's theory that if you had self-governance, you'd get some interesting results.
Yeah, I don't know exactly the mechanics by which a community note becomes a community note. if somebody posts something on Twitter that is flagged by enough, sorry, I'll say Twitter till the day I die, posted on Twitter and enough people flag it for misinformation, it'll get a public label, saying actually this is false.
I think it's basically an awkward message board interspersed with tweets, such that a tweet, somebody who is on the community notes team, and it just somehow Twitter like reaches out to you and says, you've been here a while, why don't you become a community notes person? They can draft one, and then others who are on the community notes team will see it where other regular users would not. And when they see it, they can say, I agree with this, I don't agree with it. There's a couple checkboxes for why they agree or don't agree, well-sourced or argumentative or whatever. And then they can post their own note under it, including the shorthand of NNN, no note needed, and say, well, that's just an opinion or this, that. And usually the NNN ends with stop abusing community notes. But I will say in my experience, I've seen those notes go any which way. And the ones that ultimately get shown to people are ones, for what it is worth, that seem to me to reflect the reality I perceive in the world, irrespective of Elon's views.
I mean, and I'm a big, that system that you described, that's like a mix of harnessing the power of community, but with a little bit of what you might call editorial. Like there's a certain chosen set of people who are given the ability to make community notes, or it's something other than just a populist free-for-all, I think probably does tend to yield better results. Like at a point, you do need to designate some responsible people to sort of have a light editorial function in making something like that work. The platforms really hate anything that a human has to do, and they really would object to the use of the word editorial. That hits a whole other set of, they would like to position themselves as not having any editorial discretion over content. But I'm still not sure I don't know. It would be. I'm not
Gets
sure.
back to whether fact checking works at all. It's been really interesting to see. You can apply community notes to ads on Twitter too. Ads look like tweets, but are ads, and they say ad very tiny in the corner. And there'll be an ad for some product, and then a community note that says, this product is horrible, it doesn't work, here's a link, it's broken. And then it's amazing to me that the advertiser is paying for every impression that a user gets of both their ad and the note that says, don't buy this. It's a weird economics there.
I would just add too that I think the way, I mean, at least my experience of Twitter X, there's an expression like if you invite, in the name of free speech, if you invite sort of sheep and wolves to your party, the smart sheep won't come and the dumb sheep will get eaten, and you'll end up with a party full of wolves. And I think
I have never heard this analogy before.
well-known folk saying. But anyway, whether it holds or not, I think the way that Elon Musk has embraced quote unquote free speech has opened the floodgates to a lot of hate speech that has then made a lot of people feel unsafe on the platform.
So this is a way of saying it's not just a kind of bloodless exchange of deductive propositions, but if in the name of free speech, saying anybody can say anything, and part of what they're saying is, I will find you and hurt you, then there are people who are just like, why am I here for this conversation?
Totally. I mean, it's this, in journalism, you're supposed to get a quote from both sides, but that doesn't mean every time you talk to a gay person, you need to get like a homophobic counter quote. I mean, there is a limit to that, exchange. The other thing I would say is that there's a big push that I think is correct for just like platform transparency. And Twitter used to have a very great academic API. A lot of the misinformation studies that are great came from access to that data. That's why there's a lot of misinformation studies about Twitter. It actually made it easy. Part of the reason we don't know as much about what goes on TikTok or whatever is because it's extremely difficult to get that data. That API has been severely degraded, and basically, as I understand, it doesn't really work anymore. So one thing that could really help here would be putting pressure on the platforms just to kind of open things up a little bit and allow more transparency into sort of how it works, even just for research. So,
got it. Jess, back to you. First, I should say, any thoughts on what we said so far, or just keep on keeping on?
Well, I have almost exclusively negative things to say about X. I mean, just the transformation we've seen since Elon Musk took it over it's made it almost an unusable platform to me. Like so many wild conspiracy theories are not only allowed, which again, I don't really have a problem with that, but so aggressively amplified that like it's just in your face all the time. And but I mean, this is not based in anything other than my observation from talking to people, but I found that people are maybe a little bit more willing to believe community notes because it does feel like it's coming from their peers and not coming down from the elites. And you know, similar. I've also most of the community notes I've seen have seemed good. You know, for the like they seem to be factual, and I've seen fact checks or community notes appear on Elon Musk's posts, which is heartening because you know, but. So it's interesting that there's so much distrust and I guess frustration toward the powers that be, the heads of these companies, the heads of media companies, government, kind of trying to draw the lines of what's true and what's false, that I think there is an appetite to just say like, let's talk about this as a community, let's come together and let's think about this. And so for the people I've talked to, community notes have actually been more effective in persuading them.
Allison.
We have some questions in the chat here from Zoom. One from Kate, referencing something you said, Jess, about teenagers posting wild stories to monetize their platforms, saying that it reminds them of traditional gossip magazines. Does journalism as a profession think about gossip mags at all? If so, is there something we can learn from that regarding how to deal with online incentive structures?
Journalists, news organizations are businesses. They do have to stay afloat. And of course, there's a lot of newsrooms struggle with like, how can we make people want to read our content? How can we put out the kind of clickbaity stuff that's going to get us the traffic we need to sustain our good journalism? And you know what, at the end of the day, what good journalists want to do is serve democracy, have an informed electorate. And so I'm stealing a phrase from Ben, but Ben has talked about this as kind of being getting people to eat their broccoli, getting people to consume the good, deeply reportive investigative journalism. And I think there's a bit of a dance that a lot of newsrooms do by putting out some of that less informative, more just appealing to people's baser instincts and like the kind of gossipy stories they want. And we talk about this a lot as Niemans, and we care about our audiences. We want to give them content that they care about. And I think some of that comes into question is the packaging too. How can we package these stories in a way that are going to engage a lot of people, and specifically young people? We talk a lot about how there's such a decline in consuming journalism among younger generations that we've been thinking a lot about how to bring them news content that will actually engage them at a real level.
Allison.
Yeah. Thanks so much. This is a really interesting discussion. I am just wondering, I'm very intrigued by the whole community notes approach, but I see one fatal flaw in it, in that it cannot preempt tyranny of the majority. In other words, it could do nothing to protect individual rights. And I myself see no place for ad hominem attacks on any platform. I don't see how they serve any positive purpose. So have you given any thought to incorporating those into terms of service or some kind of constitution for content moderation, lines that shouldn't be crossed in dialogue? I think that would get at the heart of a lot of what's wrong with social media today. The piling on, the name calling. As a woman, I'm like very sensitive to this. Curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, so as someone who reports on QAnon, like I've absolutely dealt with like just there's an avalanche of online abuse and harassment, and you know it feels like it's kind of par for the course with this stuff. But I certainly don't think community notes are like the gold standard, and all platforms should adopt this as their way of dealing with this. It's just kind of an observation of mine that people at least feel a little more willing to understand and hear them, listen to them. But yeah, I've seen what you're describing as well, where the community note is not actually addressing a truth or a falsehood, but kind of just attacking the poster. And so it's obviously a very flawed system. And what Ben was kind of getting at is like leaving it to the community to moderate themselves opens a big can of worms as well.
Yeah, I would just add to that I do think the more youth-focused platforms, the 13 pluses, which is to say TikTok and Snapchat, I think do both pretty effectively police against that in particular, like ad hominem bullying or, you know, for a non-public figure sort of going after somebody is pretty effectively policed, again, at least in public content, and very much explicitly against
Somebody
terms of
replies and
service.
says, die. Like that would be deleted by the platform?
You'd have your account suspended on Snapchat for that. Yeah,
Oh.
if you did it publicly. Again, like what happens if you're mean to your friend in a peer-to-peer, it's harder to, I'm sorry, harder to speak to that, but
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Got it. Jess, you titled your book The Quiet Damage. Tell us a little more about Quiet.
Sure. So a lot of the reporting that I had done prior to writing about this book, or writing this book, a lot of the writing I'd done about mis and disinformation was looking at the harms it caused to our democracy, to our public health, and there's been so much excellent journalism done in these spaces. But this book was an attempt to look into the quieter damage to friends, families, personal relationships, the stuff that we don't see and we don't hear about as much, and to kind of examine the impact of these wild online falsehoods on just the basis level of our society, which is the family.
Is there any counterpart to it? Not utterly offsetting, but is there a quiet helpfulness?
Of conspiracy theories?
No, of the platforms, of the
Oh.
modes of communication. And again, I'm not asking, trying to take us anywhere. I'm just,
Yeah, I mean, so social media I write so much about the harms of social media, but I've also seen so much of the good it can do, bringing people together, giving them a space where they feel like they find community, where they can speak about the things that matter to them. This one older couple I wrote about in the book, for Doris, the woman, the wife, social media was just pulling her into some really dark and horrible places. But for Dale, her husband, it was how he stayed connected to his former students, to his friends. It was so, as he got older, it was really important to him to keep these relationships alive. And so I'm not totally anti-social media, but I see the way that these profit incentives have really brought out the worst. And so that's what this book examines.
did you keep in touch with the families after the book came out? And I don't know if journalistic practice meant you couldn't show them anything beforehand, but I'm curious what their reaction was, what they conveyed to you after they saw the book.
I have kept in touch with them, and some of them are doing really well, others are not. I mean, this book, there's so much darkness in it. There are, like suicide attempts, there's loss of life, there's so much pain. And so for some of them, I think it was really cathartic to share their stories, and they did so because they knew that these stories could help people and help people feel less alone. But now that it's out there in the world, some of them just want to close this chapter and move on and not talk about it anymore. But I am in touch with them, and I think they're grateful for the chance to be able to connect with others through their storytelling.
And I'm just, not to be an investigative reporter myself, but I'm curious, did they feel like they were well represented? Was there anybody who was like, that's, even though you used my words, that's not what I said, or that's...
So Alice, who is a former Bernie Sanders supporter who kind of goes all the way to QAnon, she didn't have any problems with the book. She felt well represented, but there were reviews of this book in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Atlantic, and she did not like the way that those journalists wrote about her and wrote about QAnon. And so she kept like reaching out to all these reporters and demanding corrections and retractions, CCing me, which of course as an author, you want to get your book reviewed and you want all this good stuff. So that was a little bit of a frustration, but no, I mean, I spent the time to make sure I was fact checking and confirming, and really, when I do interviews with, say, public figures, I'm pretty like black and white. What you say is on the record, it's going in, this is how it's going to be. But with really softer kind of traumatic stories like this, I have a different approach, and I bring them more into the storytelling, and I let them know what to expect and get a lot of their feedback in the process of writing.
I might ask, Ben, what book would you be writing if you had your chance to write a book? What would your kind of thesis be that the world needs to hear? And of course, Jess, I'll end up asking you, what's your next book, or what's your next beat?
Oh man. Well, I don't have a fully formed book pitch in my head right now, but one of the things that I've been interested in since sort of leaving Snapchat and coming here, and we're gonna workshop this idea live, so bear with me, but I think there's a lot of discussion about mis and disinformation on the platforms, and I think obviously, as we've been talking about, that's real and incredibly valid. But when I look at, there's all these stats coming out of the election about, for the first time, a plurality of Americans saying they got their news from social media. It just edged out digital websites for the first time somewhere this year. And what I think is maybe a little bit hidden there is that there's actually just not very much news on these platforms. And I think there's a way, I spent a lot of my time at Snapchat working with the legacy news news sources, or the folks who are sort of actually doing a good job journalistically. And most of them really struggle to reach people on the platforms and still think of it as pretty secondary, or sort of a cute little ad value. And I'm very interested in an idea that's less about combating misinformation and more just about promulgating like good information, not in the positive sense, but in the rigorous sense. In other words, like put more news on the platforms. I was sitting with some data set I got that was the 100,000 TikToks related to the election that had been tagged and pulled by some third party. And the fascinating thing to me about them is less that they were misleading or false. There was obviously some of that, and mostly just how little of them actually were substantive or had anything to do with news at all. They sort of were they were memes, or they were jokes, or they were things that would sort of amplify an existing opinion. But it was sort of like, if you're saying that TikTok is your primary news source, like, sure, the misinformation is a problem, but I'm interested in the idea that another problem is just that you're actually not, you're getting your news from a place where there isn't any. So maybe it's like more information in addition to misinformation, or a way of both limiting the bad, but also finding ways to kind of increase the proportion of the good.
Does Jon Stewart count as news to you?
If he's talking about something, I mean, if you can, compared to the stuff that I'm looking at on TikTok, like, yes, distinctly. Like, a lot of this is like,
It's broccoli-shaped cereal.
it's broccoli-shaped cereal. Yeah. The top TikTok in the this data set that I was looking at least by sort of depth of engagement and like 30 million views, was just a supercut of Kamala talking about her Glock, which I think is like clever in that
Glock
if you're
pistol.
Yes, the
Yes.
gun. Yeah. If you, which is to say, if you like her, maybe you think like, what a baddie. And if you don't like her, you're like, that's fake.
There
She
was
doesn't
something
know
for
about it.
everybody in that video.
Yeah, it's sort of an amplifier regardless of what you're,
And when you say more news, then this is why I was thinking of the Jon Stewart question. There was an era, early aughts, of the citizen journalist. And that was really celebrated in quarters like these, at Shorenstein, if not at Neiman. And I do remember one conference where somebody got up and bellowed, "I'd like a citizen journalist giving me my news the way I'd like a citizen surgeon operating on my appendix," which was a memorable quote. I don't know, citizen journalism?
it is a memorable quote. I mean, I would, a lot of what comes out of the election is people having deep mistrust in the media and feeling like it's arrogant and elitist and looking down on people. And, instead of trying to understand they're eating the dogs and eating the cats, just writing stories saying, look at these dumb people in Springfield, Ohio. I might diagnose that thinking of ourselves as surgeons is maybe part of the problem there. But I've seen there's been,
Surgeons being notoriously humble.
yes, notoriously non-elite, of the people. But I mean, creator journalists is sort of the term of art to mean citizen journalists right now. And it's something I'm very interested in. We did a little, too small to call it a study, but played around on Snapchat with taking the hosts of some of the really polished professional sort of CNN-like news shows and just pulling them out and having them report the news just as a guy called Jonathan with no clear affiliation, and found that content resonated with people much, much, much more. Sort of similar information. So it's almost like some of the institutional markers, or the thing that makes a news organization look like a polished news organization, have gone from being like a heuristic for trust, which they were for a very long time, to actually like a negative relationship there. People don't trust the New York Times because it looks like the New York Times. there's obviously also like huge verification problems there. And if you trust a guy called Jonathan to tell you your news, then, you know, you'll trust
Right.
anyone else. And that sort of brings us back. So that's not a complete solution, but
To bring back a 2002 reference, it's like now the Blair Witch Project of movies, which
Exactly.
is at least needs to look like it was filmed on a dime and was found footage and all that, thanks to extremely expensive special effects and planning.
totally.
Huh?
But yeah, there's something there's clearly audience interest there. I think it's not probably the whole solution, but
Yeah. So Jess, bring us in for a landing. What's your current beat? Are you wanting to turn the crank on these topics where there's so much more to explore? Or are you into other areas?
I am still thinking really deeply about these subjects. And I think what being here at Harvard has really done for me is had me thinking more about solutions and less about just chronicling all the harms, because it's exhausting and I would like a break from that. But you know, Ben and I are taking a tech class together, and there are so many people in there who work for these different companies that I'm writing about and who are doing good, trying hard to improve these systems. And so I've been connecting with people and just trying to think about how we can bring more light to the good work that's being done. And I think people have, unfortunately, some news fatigue and just a lot of feelings of doom and gloom. And I would like to use my journalistic skills to try to amplify, some of the progress that's being made instead of just getting caught in the darkness.
Well, thank you both for your work and for showing up here today and for the work that is yet to come. And thank you all for coming too. I'm waiting for recording stop.